Greetings, everyone, and thanks again for joining us on yet another episode of the Weekly Beats. My name is Maggie Motesi, joining in from Dakar, and we have a very special guest joining us on today's episode, the founder and CEO of AirSpace Africa and iFly Global, Derek Nseko. Derek, very good to have you. And where are you joining us from, by the way?
It's a pleasure to be here as well. And whoever's listening, hello, and how are you? I am in cold Port Elizabeth today, Port Elizabeth, South Africa, which is where I live.
We're very happy to have you on the show. And something interesting has been happening in the past couple of days. Obviously, economies are opening up. People are back to travel. If you compare this to like 2 years ago or a year ago, we're seeing a lot of numbers of travelers. Not for me, obviously. I haven't at least traveled in a couple of months. But that has also come at a very interesting time where we're seeing a few shortages. But not just that, but now we're seeing jet fuel shortages or fuel jets?
That's right, jet fuel.
Yeah, and the latest is that Nigeria was suspending all local flights, and I think that changed just a couple of minutes before we started recording this podcast. But also what is interesting is I've been going through different feeds and stories on the internet. Same stories happening in South Africa, where the OR Tambo airport is running out of fuel. Of course, the minister came out last week and said that wasn't true. But as we speak now, when you go through the feed, you will see a lot of stories on people who have missed flights or cancelled flights, and they'll tell them, fuel shortages and all of that, jet fuel. But ideally, this is the first of its kind, Derek, isn't it? And I want to ask, what's really happening? This is not something that you hear, that, we don't have fuel for jets in the country.
Yeah, there's a lot of unique events that are happening around the world anyways. So we expect the effects that are rolling over from that to also be a bit unique. We're coming out of a pandemic, which is unprecedented in whatever industry that you're in, but especially aviation. So, we're still reeling from that, still suffering as an industry. And as if that wasn't bad enough, as we were trying to start seeing some signs of a recovery, and things were starting to look up. And by the way, 2022 has really been looking up, especially after Omicron started to die down. The industry got back on its feet, and we saw a bit of a mindset shift as well in terms of the governments, who I thought the governments were really being very stubborn and very draconian and very reactionary as well with the different variants that were coming around, and cross-border restrictions were really tight. And this year, even African countries that are usually very strict as well have gone ahead to relax and even follow international recommendations. We're seeing countries that are not even considering the PCR test anymore. So that has definitely stimulated demand for travel this year, and that is on the up. But I was saying, as if the pandemic wasn't bad enough, Mr. Putin decided to go and attack the Ukraine. Yeah, so that has caused its own global tremors, and Africa is part of the global economy, so we definitely have to be affected. And the fuel crisis that is now coming up is part of those supply chain disruptions that have come out of the Ukraine conflict. Yeah, so aviation, just by its existence, obviously, we're talking jets and any kind of aircraft, we run on fuel, be it Jet A1 or Avgas. So if the supply chain is affected, and this is an industry that is very, very sensitive to any economic, disruptions and any tremors in the global economy. So when something such as fuel, that is very key to airline operations, gets disrupted, airlines are bound to feel the effects very quickly and very greatly. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing frustrations start to boil over in Africa. I think Nigeria now is the biggest sign that the fuel crisis is becoming something very huge.
I mean, I think, and I really want to put my shoes in the shoes of the netizens I've seen tweeting on Twitter and other platforms where I've been engaged. It's one thing to say, we have a fuel crisis, jet fuel, and the prices have gone high, so the cost of tickets is high. And it's another thing to say, okay, the airport has no fuel. I think that looks, for me, that is completely dangerous and just feels like, is that even possible in a normal world of aviation economics, like to actually be there and not have fuel? I mean, having high prices is understandable, but could you just explain that for I don't really understand it. And when I see people actually express the same sentiments, for a moment, I think about it, I'm like, wait a minute. This is really dangerous. If you say to me you're grounding all local flights or domestic flights because we don't have fuel, you're literally cutting off transportation, and aviation plays a very key role in terms of business or even integration. So it's quite interesting times, Derek, for me. I honestly would never even know how to break that down for our listeners or viewers at this point.
Yeah, and this brings up so many different discussions, to be honest with you. Nigeria is one of the largest oil producers in the world. They produce about 1.4 billion barrels of oil a day. Yeah, so if a country like Nigeria is facing a fuel crisis, it's a bit paradoxical for any layman, because if you're hearing this is a large oil producer in the world, but they don't have fuel. So Nigeria exports pretty much most of its crude, and then the processed oil and the jet. They don't refine any jet A1. They have about 3 refineries, and they don't refine any jet A1. So all the oil, the jet A1 fuel that is used for the aviation industry is accessed through imports. And so obviously that sets its own precedent in terms in situations whereby there's issues with the supply chain. The issue now with Nigeria is that you're buying the oil. They buy the oil in dollars, and the naira has had its own fluctuations and devaluations recently, and obviously the customers, who are the passengers, they pay for their flight tickets in nairas. And Nigeria specifically, the dollar is very difficult to access, so it is now causing a serious issue, and because the price of fuel has now gone up, the airlines are extremely frustrated. So the argument now from the airline point of view was that, of course, as usually happens when the cost of operations goes up, and by the way, this is oil. I mean, fuel is generally at around 30%, even up to 40% of the airline's costs around the world in airline aviation.
So in other words, if you're, for whatever ticket you're buying, 30% of that is actually a cost that is
not necessarily, but generally in terms of the spending that the airline is going through in order to make the flights possible, or in order for the entire operation of the existence of the airline to exist. About 30% goes into just fueling aircraft. So when you have a hike in fuel prices like what has happened in Nigeria, and by the way, it's been about ×4, so the cost of airline operations has gone up to such a point, as reported by the airline operators of Nigeria, that the cost, the fuel is now occupying 90% of airline operations.
That's really huge.
It's huge. It's extremely huge, and it's not.
It leaves no room for profitability. You're basically operating losses, and it brings me to another question. We already have a struggling airlines industry, and I'm sorry to say, barely airlines in Africa make profits. aside from a few like Ethiopian Airlines, Egyptian Air, like when you look at the likes of airlines that we have, small airlines and those that have actually just been revived even recently, they're operating losses for such a long period of time. And then you had COVID coming, which literally just buried all of that. And now they're trying to bounce back. And then there's a cost of fuel. Where does that leave the industry? What are we looking at?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about profitability or the lack of it, most of the airlines, Nigeria itself has about 23 airlines, not necessarily all making money, and it's thin lines that we work with in the aviation industry, very thin margins. So if costs are not driven down big time, chances are you're not going to make any money. So as costs of operations are going up because of rising fuel prices, definitely our airlines are going to get further and further into the negatives. And just as you said, airlines are already not making money. The African continent, very few airlines have gotten into a profit, even before the pandemic, let alone a fuel crisis that we're talking about. So we are now in an environment, by the way, our airlines already have cumulative debt from the pandemic, which is huge. And that already was expected to drive up the price of the airline tickets as airlines try to get back into the green because they are paying off huge debts. So if you compound that with fuel prices, then the only result is either ticket prices go up big time, which also means that the appetite for travel is going to go down, which then also falls back onto the airlines that they definitely are going to make much less money as well. Then it means the industry will only be driven further and further downwards. And then it does pose an existential crisis for some of the airlines that might be even struggling. So it's possible to see some airlines going under again this year as well because of the issues that are plaguing the industry right now. We don't expect our airlines to make money for some time, but you can see as well efforts are being made by so many airlines around Africa to try and mitigate all these different situations that are happening around us, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, obviously for me it's going to be interesting to watch, and I don't really want to divert from the jet fuel, Derek, but I'm always puzzled by the fact that we have lots of small airlines with small countries, and I'm sorry to say small countries, and I've never understood really the idea of having bits and bits of airlines that I'm usually thinking, shouldn't we like have really big regional airlines that do this and then have domestic ones? This whole idea I have never, but this is like quite diverting from what we've been talking about.
No, that is still it's a relevant discussion to have on the African continent. Over 200, I mean, I told you Nigeria's more than 23.
That's a lot. These guys don't even have a national airlines, do they?
They don't. At least they do have a population in the hundreds of millions. So perhaps you can see that the market might be there, but Africa, I mean, more than 200 airlines. So at the last time I checked. So there's quite a number. There's too many, and the problem is that these are all small entities. In aviation, most small airlines are struggling.
My understanding, I also feel like maybe actually airlines, especially government-owned airlines and all of this, need to plan a little bit further, or rather maybe the planning is, I don't know, I would assume that for anybody that saw the war in Ukraine, of course the impact it had on countries in Europe or the Western world, or even obviously what we've been seeing over the past months, this is something that could have been prevented or planned for a little bit in advance. But again, I don't know whether these are things
we're talking about government airlines. You're talking about government airlines. There's not a lot of foresight and long-term planning in government entities in Africa, especially the airlines. It's definitely an issue because it also speaks to the reason why the airlines are not making money. But also sometimes you also understand that very often the rationale behind the creation of the airlines is not economic. So they're not driven by economic interests all the time. So
Well,
it
tell me
becomes
about
even
that. If they are not driven
yeah.
by economic interest, then what are they driven by? Because you're
If
spending taxpayers' money
yes,
to run an airline. It's supposed to bring back in the money and create
it,
ecosystems.
it
Isn't
is
that what it's supposed
supposed
to be?
it is supposed to, but I'm judging by the decisions that are made.
Yeah.
The decisions are not driven by economics. They're driven by so many different factors. You know, there's a lot of politics as well. You know, so you were talking about uh, having larger airlines and coming together to create airlines. All these things have happened before, but politics. Whenever the governments are involved, politics comes into it. East Africa, where we're both from, has had an East African Airways that was owned by the three largest East African countries, or the largest economies in Africa, and that had to go down as well because of largely political reasons. Uganda had a joint venture with South Africa and Tanzania, Alliance Air, a while back, and the partnership just could not work, from that point of view. And we've had so many across Africa, and they tend to fail because of the same reason. So you almost come to the conclusion that government joint ventures really they just have no place. Yeah.
It's time to privatize
I think
airline.
privatization, yes, privatization could definitely be a way to go. Yeah, if it's possible. Otherwise, yes, our governments really cannot keep their hands off the runnings of the national airlines. That's the biggest issue that we have on the African continent.
Honestly, I know a lot of people that might not be happy about talking about privatization, but I know this is a topic we need to delve deeper into it. And I think, Derek, maybe on our next episode, we can touch on privatization, especially for the airlines industry, if we are literally going to be able to create ecosystems around the sector. Because I also feel like it's far away. It's a sector that is very important when we talk about the AFCFTA, when we talk about integration in Africa. We're looking at aviation, and yet deeper, we know that it's still challenging because even our own airspace across the continent is not fully open. So, I mean, it's a very nice conversation to touch deeper, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. However, I'm going to give you less than a minute to give us, I know I myself too, I'm really worried about traveling at this point because I'm thinking, how much is my ticket going to be if I'm actually going to travel? And at this point, I'm like, I wish I could speak to an expert. I'm happy to have you on the show today. And it's like, okay, what are we looking at? What should we brace ourselves for as travelers, as business people who want to go everywhere?
Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot help the price of your ticket for your next trip. So
thanks for the bad news.
that's not my territory unless I can come up with a really sustainable model for a new airline idea, but I don't think that is on the horizon right now as we speak. But I mean, the landscape is ever changing. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 2-3 months. Anything could happen. My hope is that the crisis in Europe probably comes to an end as soon as possible. My other hope is that we do not get any pandemic-related news for the foreseeable future. I'm talking about different variants of COVID-19. I think we need some stability right now and a positive trajectory to take our industry back. We need to get back that appetite for travel. I know there's a lot of people who have not traveled you've said you've not traveled in months. I've not traveled in over a year. So it's it's and I badly want to get back and travel, especially internationally. So I can't wait for that. But it's positive signs right now, to be honest. Generally, the fuel crisis aside, I think based on the last 2 years that we've had, I think the aviation industry is in a much better place, and we are going into a better place. But there's so much to learn from the COVID pandemic, and I hope our airlines have learned that. I can see that there's a lot of change as well that has happened, even in Africa. We were talking about partnerships. A lot of partnerships are happening across the African continent, and I think that is a result of the crisis giving us a reality check. You can see what Kenya Airways is trying to do with South African Airways, and trying to inspire more of that kind of partnership across the industry. So I really hope that this comes to fruition, because I think this is exactly what we need as an African continent. We need to work together to solve our problems. Our destinies are intertwined as Africa, so that is the way to go.
Absolutely. Derek, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show and for breaking down this for us. And obviously, we're hoping that our ticket prices don't go as high, because we can't find solutions to that. But nevertheless, it's really nice to have you on, and everybody joining us on the podcast, on the broadcast. Thanks a lot for tuning in. The Weekly Beat by Mansa. You can follow more on the website, www.mansamedia.africa, or on our social media pages, mansamedia_Africa. Just leave us a message, or just give a follow and see the updates. Here's to peace and profits, and have a very lovely week ahead.